When will Israel's wailing end? From the Wailing Wall to the Dome of the Rock. In the old city of Jerusalem, there is a wall. It is a place where countless people stand before it to weep and pray, writing their wishes on paper and placing them between the stones. That place is what they commonly call the Wailing Wall, and what Jewish people call the Kotel, the Western Wall. This wall is not merely an ancient ruin. It is the wound, memory, and waiting of the people of Israel. And at the same time, it is one of the most sensitive points in biblical prophecy and world religious history. Then we may ask this question: how long will Israel continue to wail? When indeed will their wailing come to an end? The history of the Wailing Wall cannot be separated from the history of the Jerusalem temple. According to the Bible, Israel's first temple, the first temple, was built during the reign of King Solomon. But the story of the Jerusalem temple did not begin the moment Solomon built the structure. The building called the temple was completed in Solomon's day, but the spiritual meaning of that place goes much farther back, all the way to Genesis. In the Bible, the shadow of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount first appears in the days of Abraham. In Genesis 14, after returning from war, Abraham meets a mysterious figure. He is Melchizedek. Melchizedek was the king of Salem and at the same time priest of God Most High. Salem is traditionally connected with the later Jerusalem. Then Jerusalem was already a special land from the days of Abraham, where the mystery of kinship, priesthood, and worship dwelt together. Abraham gave him a tithe, and Melchizedek blessed Abraham. In the Christian tradition, this scene has been read as an event that foreshadows the temple and the Messiah. But the scene where the meaning of the Temple Mount becomes clearer is Genesis 22. God speaks to Abraham, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah." On a mountain in the land of Moriah, Abraham was about to offer Isaac as a burnt offering. There, God tested Abraham's faith, and at the same time, he himself provided the ram to be offered instead of Isaac. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," that is, Jehovah Jireh. This is not merely the story of one family. This event shows in advance the essence of the temple. What is the temple? It is the place where human beings offer sacrifices before God. It is the place where blood sacrifices are offered, so that sinners may come before God. And ultimately, it is the place where God Himself prepares the sacrifice. Amazingly, 2 Chronicles 31 later describes the place where Solomon built the temple in this way. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. In other words, Solomon's temple was not built just anywhere. It was a place connected to Moriah, where Abraham had intended to offer Isaac, on the very land where the revelation was. Given that God Himself provides the sacrifice, the Temple of Israel will later be built. Another important event is Jacob's encounter at Bethel. While fleeing from his brother Esau, Jacob stopped at a place to sleep and had a dream. He saw a ladder reaching from earth to heaven, and he saw the angels of God ascending and descending on it. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he was afraid and said, "This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." And he called the name of that place Bethel, meaning the house of God. Of course, geographically, Bethel is not the same place as Jerusalem's Temple Mount, but Jacob's confession shows the theological meaning of the temple. The temple is the place where heaven and earth meet. It is the place where the presence of God comes down into human history. It is the place where people worship God and encounter Him. Therefore, in Genesis, the seeds of the temple have already been sown. Melchizedek Salem, Abraham's Moriah, and Jacob's Bethel. All these scenes later converge in the Jerusalem temple. And as time passes, the era of David arrives. Because of the census, David experiences God's judgment. And at the place where the plague stops, he builds an altar. That place was the threshing floor of Araunah, or Ornan, the Jebusite. David buys that land for a price. He says that he cannot offer to God a sacrifice that costs him nothing. That very place later becomes the site of Solomon's temple. 2 Chronicles 30복음 says that the place where Solomon built the temple was Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, the place where the Lord appeared to David, and the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Now the location of the temple becomes clear. It is the place where Abraham's obedience took place. It is the place where Isaac's sacrifice was foreshadowed. It is the place where God provided the sacrifice. It is the place where David experienced mercy in the midst of judgment. And it is the place where Solomon built the temple for the name of God. Therefore, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is not like any ordinary religious site. It is a place that God repeatedly marked throughout the entire Bible. It is a land where the meanings of God's presence, sacrifice, atonement, kingship, judgment, mercy, and restoration are layered one upon another. Yet today, the Dome of the Rock stands on that very land. We must understand this fact in order to grasp the meaning of the Wailing Wall more deeply. The Wailing Wall is not merely a trace of a destroyed temple. That wall is Israel's tears over the loss of God's place, the place of sacrifice, the place of covenant, and the place where the name of God had dwelt. Continuing from Genesis onward. The reason Israel weeps is not simply that they lost one building. They lost Abraham's Moriah, David's altar, and Solomon's temple. And more than anything, they lost the center, where they offered the sacrifices to God. This temple was more than a building. It was the place where God's name dwelt, the center, where Israel offered sacrifices and came before God. But in 586 BC, when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon captured Jerusalem, the first temple was destroyed. The destruction of the temple did not merely mean that one structure had disappeared. For Israel, it was a national tragedy in which the covenant with God was shaken. The nation collapsed, and the people were carried away into exile. Later, by the decree of Cyrus, king of Persia, the Jewish people returned, and the second temple was built. And later still, Herod the Great greatly expanded this temple. The Western Wall, called the Wailing Wall, today is not part of the temple building itself, but part of the Western retaining wall that supported the Temple Mount, expanded by Herod. However, in AD 70, when the Roman general Titus captured Jerusalem, the second temple was also destroyed. The temple fell, the sacrifices ceased, and the Jewish people were scattered again. What remained were piles of stones, memories, and one wall. The Jewish people stood before that wall and mourned the destruction of the temple. They longed for the presence of God and waited for the restoration of the temple. That is why, in the West, this place came to be called the Wailing Wall. Even today, prayer continues daily before that wall. There are separate prayer areas for men and women. Men wear kippas and people place written prayers between the cracks in the wall. Coming-of-age ceremonies, such as bar, mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs are held there, and oath ceremonies for Israeli soldiers are also conducted there. Therefore, before it is a tourist site, the Wailing Wall is a symbol of Jewish identity, faith, and waiting that has not yet ended. But above this wall, on the Temple Mount, another enormous structure stands today. A building that stands as if dominating Jerusalem's skyline with its golden dome. It is the Dome of the Rock. According to Volume 7 of the Jewish Dictionary, which consists of a total of 12 volumes, the Dome of the Rock is a representative holy site of Islam, built in 688 AD by the Caliph Abdul Malik of the Umayyad dynasty. Although many people also refer to it as a mosque, in Islamic tradition, this is regarded as the place where Muhammad experienced the night journey and ascension. For that reason, it is also a very important holy place for Muslims. But from the perspective of Judaism, this place has an entirely different meaning. That is because it is the site where the temple once stood, the Temple Mount, where sacrifices were offered to God. On the most sacred place for the Jewish people, there now stands not a Jewish temple, but an Islamic sanctuary. Here a biblical question arises. In the book of Daniel, and in the words of Jesus, the expression the abomination of desolation appears, or, as we often say, the detestable thing. Daniel speaks of a power that defiles the holy place, stops the sacrifices, and profanes the place that belongs to God. Jesus also said in Matthew 24, "When you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place." Historically, this expression has been interpreted in connection with several events. These include the desecration of the Jerusalem temple by Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC, the destruction of the temple by Rome in AD 70, and interpretations that see it as an even greater desecration of the temple in the last days. But biblical prophecy often does not end with a single event. It shows a recurring pattern, something that is not God standing in the place that belongs to God. Foreign religion and power taking their place in the holy place. The center of worship that should be offered to God being replaced by another religious symbol. This is the core of the concept of the detestable thing. From that perspective, the Dome of the Rock is not merely a building. From the standpoint of Israel's faith, it is a symbol of a foreign religion standing where the temple has disappeared. On the Temple Mount, the land where God had placed his name and where the people of Israel offered sacrifices to God, there now stands a building inscribed with the confession of another faith. In particular, the inscriptions inside the Dome of the Rock acknowledge Jesus as a prophet, while also including content that denies his divinity. From the perspective of Christian faith, this is a very important contrast. That is because the Bible testifies that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, the true temple, and the only way to come to God. Yet, the building erected on the Temple Mount contains a confession of faith that denies the divinity of Jesus. Therefore, this issue is not simply a territorial dispute between Judaism and Islam. From a Christian perspective, it is a matter of worship, a matter of God's holiness, and a matter related to the spiritual order of the last days. Of course, there's something that must be made clear here. This does not mean that we should hate individual Muslims. Biblical discernment is not hatred toward people, but distinguishing before God what is holy and what is not holy. God loves people, but he hates idolatry and false worship. The entire history of Israel testifies to that very fact. Israel was judged because of idolatry. Even when the temple existed, if the heart departed from God, the temple could not serve as a shield. Both the first temple and the second temple eventually fell. But God did not completely abandon Israel. Within their railing, there is not only judgment, but also the promise of restoration. Then when will Israel's wailing end? After the temple was destroyed, the Jewish people lived scattered for many centuries without a nation. For them, Jerusalem was not merely a city, but a name that symbolized the lost temple and the lost nation. For them, Jerusalem was not merely a city, but a name that symbolized the lost temple and the lost nation. Every Passover, they said, next year in Jerusalem, waiting for the day they would return to Zion. And at last, in 1948, Israel declared independence. When David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel, the Jewish people gained the nation again after nearly 2,000 years of diaspora. This was clearly the beginning of a historical restoration. But that restoration was not yet complete. Immediately after Israel's declaration of independence, neighboring Arab states intervened militarily, and the First Middle East War began in earnest. As a result of the 1948 war, Jerusalem was divided east and west. West Jerusalem came under Israeli control, and East Jerusalem, including the Old City, came under Jordanian control. The Jewish people had regained the nation, but they could not go to their holiest place of prayer. They had become independent, but they still could not stand before the Wailing Wall. Israel's wailing had not yet ended. Then in June 1967, the Third Middle East War, commonly known as the Six-Day War, broke out. As a result of this war, Israel gained control of East Jerusalem and the Old City of Jerusalem, and after 19 years, the Jewish people were able to stand before the Wailing Wall again. The Jewish people were able to access the Wailing Wall again. But the administration of the Temple Mount above it remains complex. Israel maintains overall security control, but the day-to-day administration of the Temple Mount is handled by the Islamic Waqf. Jewish people are able to pray at the Wailing Wall, but public Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount is an extremely sensitive issue. In other words, Jewish people look toward their holiest place and pray just below it. The Temple Mount is before their eyes, but there is no temple. They are close, yet they have not arrived. This is the deepest symbol carried by the Wailing Wall. Archaeological discoveries make this waiting even more vivid. The ancient pilgrimage road leading from the city of David up to the Temple Mount has been excavated, and coins, traces of commerce, and pilgrims' paths from the Second Temple period have been uncovered. The actual road by which Jewish people once went up to the temple during the feasts is appearing in the world again. This excavation, in which history buried on the ground is being revealed again, seems not merely an archaeological event, but a recovery of forgotten memory. But the wall is still a wall. The wailing has not yet ended. Israel's wailing will not end simply because the stones of the temple are rebuilt. True restoration will take place when God dwells among His people again, and when Israel fully returns before God. From the perspective of Christian faith, at the center of that restoration is Jesus Christ, the Messiah. He is greater than the ruined temple and is the true mediator between God and humanity. Therefore, the Wailing Wall is a relic of the past, and at the same time, a prophetic question directed toward the future. Who is standing in the place that belongs to God? What is erected in the holy place? Is Israel's wailing merely sorrow over a lost building? Or is it a cry over a lost relationship with God? Today, the Dome of the Rock may appear to be one of Jerusalem's most beautiful buildings. But from a biblical perspective, it is also a symbol of the deepest conflict, a mark of another faith standing on the place where God's temple once stood. A center of foreign religion established on holy ground. For that reason, in some Christian interpretations, it is viewed as foreshadowing the detestable thing of the last days, or as its climactic symbol. Israel is still wailing. Before the Wailing Wall, looking toward the Temple Mount, they are waiting for the lost temple and the restoration that has not yet come. When will Israel's wailing end? When will Jerusalem's tears cease? The Bible says, when God comforts Zion again, when the Messiah reigns as king, when no detestable thing can stand in the holy place any longer, when true worship offered to God is restored, then Israel's wailing will end. The Wailing Wall is still speaking. The temple has fallen, but the promise of God has not fallen. And Jesus is asking us today as well, what is standing in the holy place now? When Israel recognizes Jesus Christ, the spiritual temple, as the Messiah, then within the order established by God, the place where the temple once stood will again be restored as the center of worship offered to God. The place where the temple once stood will again be restored as the center of worship offered to God. Then Israel's wailing will end, and the song of restoration will begin.